After the demigod Hercules had accomplished his 11th labour, giving himself a 5-finger discount to Zeus's golden apples, he stopped to rest on the banks of the Po River. In those times, however, the area was overridden with thieving giants who plundered the small villages in the surrounding countrysides. Learning of the hero's mini-break in the area, the elders of the villages approached Hercules and implored him to help rid them of the giants. When they said help, they really meant, if he could do it. Ever ready for a bout of fisticuffs, in no time at all our demigod was able to kill all the offending giants and free the region from their reign of terror. The overjoyed inhabitants wanted to reward Hercules by giving him their most precious possessions. However, Hercules decided that what these people needed was a place where they could protect themselves in case new brigands arrived. He couldn't stick around, he had heroing to do. So he founded a fortified city and gave it the name of his mother, Alcmena, which later turned into Cremona, meaning mighty. And this is the Renaissance take on why the city is called Cremona. Hello and welcome to the Violin Chronicles, a podcast in which I, Linda Lespe, will attempt to bring to life the story surrounding famous, infamous, or just not very well known, but interesting violin makers of history. I'm a violin maker and restorer. I graduated from the French violin making school some years ago now, and I currently live and work in Sydney with my husband Antoine, who is also a violin maker and graduate of the French school, l'École nationale de lutherie in Mirecourt. As well as being a luthier, I've always been intrigued with the history of instruments I work with, and in particular, the lives of those who made them. So often when we look back at history, I know that I have a tendency to look at just one aspect, but here my aim is to join up the puzzle pieces and have a look at an altogether fascinating picture. So join me as I wade through tales not only of fame, famine and war, but also of love, artistic genius, revolutionary craftsmanship, determination, cunning and bravery that all have their part to play in the history of the violin. In the previous episodes of the Violin Chronicles, we saw Andrea Amati setting up his workshop, the life of the city, how it was run, and the movement of humanism, its effects on education, and finally the Reformation, the influence the church had on people's lives, especially those of the artisan class. Andrea's workshop had been up and running for about 10 years when news came that the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V would be visiting the city in August. It was all anyone could talk about. They were going to erect a triumphal arch, there would be celebrations, feasting, and of course music. Everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of the ruler. The excitement was palpable. Andrea, his wife, and their son, the little 5-year-old Antonio, would have been in the crowd that came out to catch a glimpse of the emperor passing through Cremona. But now Andrea is fulfilling a royal order. The violin is having a coming-of-age moment and starting to be fashionable to the point that the trend-setting French royal court is making orders for Cremonese violins. And so it begins. What violin maker out there is unfamiliar with the phrase, "I'm looking for a Cremonese instrument"? Join me as we look at the fashionistas who set the ball rolling. Every city wants to look their best if the Holy Roman Emperor passes through. They were still working on containing heretics, and questions still abounded on how the church would approach things such as music. Groups of thinkers or academies were popping up all over Renaissance Italy, and ideas about the nature of music, its purpose and power were being discussed. So there were sort of like scientific things happening, right? You had Galileo and everything. And my thought process is the music, I felt like they were like music texts where they say, it kind of moves your soul. It has this physical impact. And I was thinking it's not so strange that they would approach music in a scientific way, but in the same way as like, oh, well, you've got gravity, you've got the stars, and music, we can actually physically feel something when we hear music. So we may as well treat it almost like a science. They're doing all these sciences, like why not music? And it's overlapped into the religious sphere as well because it's had to do with your soul and your inner being sort of thing.
I'm John Gagne. I'm a senior lecturer in history at the University of Sydney, and I work mostly on European history from the 13th to the 18th centuries. So I suppose the first thing to say about that is that also the ancients had a strong mathematical sense of music. Pythagoras' theory was that, you remember that the parable of the reeds, and you cut reeds to a certain length and they make a certain tone if you blow through the top of the reed. And I think the mathematical, I forget the mathematical formula, but it's sort of like the length of a string is inversely proportional to the sound that it makes. And so that was established in antiquity, but became increasingly of interest. I mean, people had known about that for centuries through the Middle Ages, but with the advancement of certain techniques, interest returned to, let's say, the mathematical qualities of music. There was a huge tradition to draw upon. I mean, one of the examples is something like St. Augustine, who was writing in late antiquity, who wrote a treatise on mathematics, but it was all about music. So they were always kind of intertwined. Maybe the best exact case study to think about is the astronomer Johannes Kepler, who lived around the same time as Galileo, slightly earlier, and was very interested in this Pythagorean theory of music and arithmetic. And he was one of the proponents of the idea of the music of the spheres, which has an interesting core idea, which is that if we think of proportion of distance, it can be the string of an instrument, but it could also be the distance between 2 planets or 3 planets or 4 planets. And so the idea was that if we could imagine reeds and strings having a relationship of mathematical sound to, within the mathematical system, then why could we not also imagine the distance between the planets having the same kind of relationship? And that was an elaboration of a pre-existing idea that there were spheres in which all of the planets of the galaxy moved, and that they produced, therefore, a sound, which was not, let's say, a real sound, but resonated with your soul. So that the music of the universe was a kind of naturally God-established harmony in which mathematical proportions from the minuscule to the galactic made sense and resonated with the natural proportions of our soul.
And that's universal harmony?
Yep. Oh. Yes, and then of course, then as you said, it becomes kind of a cultural trope. People begin to play with the idea of the music of the spheres. It becomes a poetic inspiration in the 16th and 17th centuries, when poets begin to use the idea of the universal harmony, the music of the spheres, to write poetry about concord in general, between humans, between God and man, between all living beings. And so it was a very powerful idea, which I think it remains a powerful idea, to think that there's something rational and proportional in the universe, and that it works on, let's say, a scale of sizes from the minuscule to the most enormous.
And so when you see like those Renaissance, because the violin is drawn in a very sort of Renaissance mathematical type way, would they have been sort of inspired by that idea of, was that all like one big thing?
Definitely in terms of the mathematics. I think that's part of the when you go back to the 15th century and you look at some of the most successful artists of that period, just in terms of religious art. Most of them, I'm thinking here of artists like the 15th century artist Piero della Francesca, or Leonardo da Vinci, or the German artist Albrecht Dürer, who was a contemporary. They all leave sketchbooks where they've got measurements of man down to the, we all know the so-called Vitruvian man of Leonardo, which is the man with his arms outstretched, his legs wide, and using a circle in a square. But artists had much more complex methods of showing the proportionality of the human body, about, let's say the size of the hand to the height of a man, or the size, the span of arms to the height. So this is basically a workshop method for most working artists, was to understand the proportionality of the body, which could be broadcast into other media. So for instance, what made a building pleasurable to be inside was the fact that it corresponded to a natural proportion of the human body. And so you would build buildings in, scales that were scaled up or down from the size of a human. It's like 15 men high or something like that. So I imagine that probably when it comes to the design, the increasing complexity of the design of violins, there's something similar at work there, which is that artists and mathematicians already know how to think proportionally and to work out in sort of grids the best proportion for whatever they're constructing, whether it be a building or an instrument. And I think that's probably what we see in development over the course of the 16th and 17th century, is the kind of mathematical perfection of an instrument according to those rules of proportion.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for the universal harmony thing. I was wondering about that. Andrea Amati is now working in a time of counter-reformation in Cremona. We spoke about this in the last episode, and although church music was predominantly vocal, there was also the organ and a few musicians. When voices were lacking, they would begin to replace a voice with a viola, and the strings would often double or replace a vocal part accompanying the mass. These musicians would also work for the local council, playing music for outdoor processions, where louder wind or brass instruments would be needed to carry the tune. I spoke to Peter Jensen about the 16th century attitude to music and the differing views reformers and churches had to musical expression. And so, yeah, it's interesting that this is the time they were living in, and what they would have seen and done was directly a result of this counter-reformation.
Indeed, it was the intellectual and spiritual world in which people were living.
And they're working for musicians who are playing in the church, and composers at the time. They would compose and they would write, and they're saying, according to the Council of Trent, I have written this composition. So they would quote it just to be like because at the same time around then there was a little bit of an inquisition going on. So you wanted to be. Yes. It was actually quite risky to be an artist or a musician in that world, because you could easily be accused of heresy.
I'm sure. Now, amongst the reformers, Luther he loved music. He thought that if you're going to be in the ministry, you will need to be a musician as well, or you need to love music. And he wrote these hymns and so forth and so on. Other people of the reformers took slightly different views. A man called Zwingli in Switzerland was, I believe, a good musician, but he wasn't in favour of music in church. He thought it would be too sensuous, you needed to hear the word of God, and having music in church was a bit like having statues in church. That was visual, the other was oral. But that was not the majority view. The majority view by the great John Calvin, for example, a Frenchman, but in Geneva, majority view was that we needed music in church, and in particular, they looked at the Bible and they saw the book of Psalms was there. So they were particularly interested in the Psalms, and in some places...
Sorry, can I just say Psalms are actually songs. There's actually musical little directions.
Exactly. So it's in the Bible.
Yeah.
What they did was they would in some places have the Psalms just as they were written in the vernacular language. In the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, for example, the Psalms are set for the day. They change depending which Sunday it is. There are also some songs sung by the Virgin Mary, for example, called the Magnificat, and other songs in the prayer book, and you would either say them or sing them.
Well, people get really passionate about music, and in that era, in the Renaissance,
You've noticed, have you? Yes.
Well, in the Renaissance, they were talking about, you had the science and the spheres, and and there was this idea that music was so powerful and it moves your soul, and because everyone knows you're moved by music, and they're saying if this thing that can move our souls, and our eternal souls are in danger if we do it wrong.
Yes.
And you can see why they were really a little bit worried about it. They're like,
as well as
today I feel like we'll go, oh, music, yeah, it's good for you and this, but there they were like, it's such this force that can really has a power to send you to hell.
For good or for bad, it could be demonic.
So I mean, that's why in church, I think church music was such a thing that was spoken about and debated about, and can we do this or not? Because you're killing people if you're doing it wrong, or you're saving them if you do it right.
So, and hence some would say don't do it at all. But most said, yes, let's do it.
Oh, yeah, to be on the safe side.
But let's do it with the sound.
Zwingli. And he actually went around destroying instruments.
Did he?
Yeah. So
yes. Well,
burning things.
He was a little bit strong. He was a good man in many ways, but he had his
moments.
Had his moments, shall we say. It was a tough world.
Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly caused controversy.
Yeah, well, I was reading different documents, and a lot of it was often like a kid you didn't really know what to do with. You'd send them to a monastery, or there was one of the Amatis was, they're living in this house and there's all these kids, and the 16-year-old, he's a priest. And I'm like, what's and he's still living at home. And I was like, that's an interesting dynamic. And then some of them, you read accounts of things like complaints and things, and you see their ages, and they're teenagers.
Yes.
And they've just been sent to these monasteries, and they're bored.
Yes, bearing in mind that people didn't live as long in any case. So 16-year-olds...
Except these guys.
Well, some of them did, of course. But one of the things the Reformation did by saying no to monasteries and convents and so forth, it changed the attitude, I believe it changed the attitude to work. An ordinary person's work was just as important as people in the monastery and so forth and so on.
Now, the Italian Wars that we spoke about in the first episode of the Violin Chronicles were ending, and Italy was entering into a period of prosperity and economic boom. Cremona has a population of 36,000 people. There are 40 music and dance teachers and 1 instrument maker on the books. And this, my friends, was our star, Andrea. Cremona had made its mark as a musical centre of the region. Andrea was receiving important commissions, and in 1566 a new choirmaster was appointed to the cathedral. His name was Marcantonio Ingegneri. This was good news for the Amatis, as not only was the new choirmaster a composer, he was also a violinist, and this could only be good for business. What's more, he was talking about creating a group of musicians in the church, a type of orchestra. Amongst his students was a young man called Claudio Monteverdi. We shall get to him soon. Around 1560, the 10-year-old Girolamo, Andrea's second son, after coming back from school, would have helped in the workshop where his father and older brother were busy ever since the exciting news of the royal order for Charles IX, King of France. This order would also have been a sign to any inquiring inquisitors that the Amatis were above suspicion of heresy, as this order was destined for the very Catholic court of France. John Dilworth is a violin maker, restorer, and prolific writer and researcher. He's been a regular contributor to the Strad magazine and published numerous papers about instruments and violin makers, contributing to many specialised books on the subject. He's been a teacher, lecturer, and judge in competitions, and now he'll tell us his thoughts on Andrea Amati. John Dilworth tells us about Andrea's working style and the interesting fact of labelling and dating his instruments, something we don't think too much about these days, but was in fact a novel move on his part.
In Cremona, right from the get-go, Andrea Amati was always very careful to sign and date his labels, so we know where we are with those. And it's very significant. I think that in Cremona, he was very conscious. He was making for posterity, really. You know, when you look at paintings and other artifacts from the time, it wasn't common to put the date on. You would sign, Michelangelo made this or whatever, but you don't often get a date. But I think it's significant that in Cremona, Andrea, to begin with, did, and he was getting commissions from, the most notable thing, from the court of Charles IX in France. So it was clear he was already famous. He was getting from the most powerful court in Europe at the time. He was being asked to make a celebratory set of instruments. So he was clearly aware of his position and prominence and his skill. So he signed it and dated it, and all his successes in Cremona, because he is the fountainhead of all the Cremonese tradition. It's his sons and his grandson, his great-grandson, who were right at the heart of everything, and everyone who subsequently worked in Cremona learnt directly or indirectly from them.
Girolamo would no doubt wonder about the young king of France, who was the same age as himself, as he helped out with this impressive order for instruments being constructed for a boy king. They had to make 12 large-sized violins, 12 small-sized violins, 6 violas, and 8 bass violins or cellos. But that wasn't all. They had detailed instructions on how the instruments were to be decorated with the royal coat of arms, symbols of the king, justice, and the House of Valois. These instruments would become known as the Charles IX instruments, and are perhaps the most well-known work of Andrea Amati. The painted instruments of Andrea have been the stuff of legends over the years, and there has been much speculation over the images and who the instruments were really made for. But what we do know for certain is that the artworks on the instruments were by Cremonese artists, and that the town had an established school of painting and produced many fine craftsmen in this domain. John Dilworth extrapolates.
A big question about the Andrea Amati instruments, that the ones that were made for Charles IX, that have all this decorative painting on the backs, and all sorts of people have tried to make a case that these paintings were made by Leonardo or something, something ridiculous. My feeling is that he did get a local painter to do that. I did quite a lot of research into that, showing pictures of the back and close-ups and everything around museums and galleries, and they said, this fits in perfectly with the Cremonese school of painting, which I didn't really know was such a thing, but every town in Italy seems to have had a school of painting, and they bandy around a few names that I'd never heard of before, but are known to experts. So there is that I can well imagine that Amati got the thing finished and then went to a chap next door who happened to be the local artist, and said, I want some Catherine on the back of this violin. And he paints it in and goes back to Amati's workshop to be varnished over.
It is also probable that Catherine de Medici, the king's mother, also had a hand in obtaining this set of instruments. The Cremonese were immensely proud of the skill of their painters and indeed had a thriving community of artists, so that when Andrea and his sons were making this set of instruments for Charles IX, there would have been little doubt that they would call upon one of the many talented local painters to decorate the instruments. And so, knowing Catherine's taste of all things luxurious, violins were ordered from Cremona. I spoke to Dr. Susan Broomhall about Catherine, who is more or less supposed to be the person responsible for ordering this large set of instruments from the Amatis. The existence of these violins would have played a role in a far larger story of what was going on in the Valois court, and were not simply musical instruments, but statements, in part and amongst many other objects, describing who these people were and what they wanted others to think of them.
My name is Susan Broomhall, and I'm the Director of the Gender and Women's History Research Centre at the Australian Catholic University. I'm a historian by training, and I work on women and gender ideologies and assumptions in the early modern period in Europe. Yes, so Catherine is a very unusual individual because she spends almost all her life in the spotlight, in the centre of political intrigue in Europe. She spends most of her life in France, where she is both the Queen of France, and in the French context, to be the Queen is always to be a consort of a king. There's no option to be Queen in your own right, the ruler in your own right. And then she is the mother of 3 successive kings who are her sons, which is quite a remarkable innings, I guess, of somebody in the public eye, where she's spent most of her life from early teen years right through until she dies, and very much influential at the French court. Because of her name, Catherine de Medici, most people will link her to the Medici family in Italy. They are, of course, very prominent in Florence, and she is indeed part of that family. But her mother was French, so very often people think of her as an Italian. She is part Italian and also partly French. That's quite important because when she went to France, often people would see her as a foreigner. Most of the people who are critical of her and most of the propaganda about her tags her as a foreigner. But in fact, her mother was French. That said, she grew up in Florence and in Rome, and I think she always carried with her the imprint of Italian design, Italian culture, the way that the Italian courts at that time in the early Renaissance were using fashion and art for political purpose. She carried a lot of those ideas with her to France, and I think she very often looked back to Italy as a source of inspiration for artistic plans.
And do you think that's from her upbringing, that she had this love of the arts, and is that about how she was brought up?
I think it's very much part of the style of the Italian Renaissance courts at this time, that people understood then in a way that perhaps we don't always connect together now, that cultural forms were forms of politics, that you told messages about your political situation, about your context, about your identity, and certainly propaganda. You did that through cultural means. That's how you showed prestige. So I think it's a normal kind of process for those courts at the time to think of arts as a way to demonstrate power. So that kind of connection is one I think we might have lost as we think about power now. We think of it in a kind of parliamentary setting. For the leaders of that period, culture is power. And so this kind of artistic display, and I mean artistic in the broader sense of architecture, music, arts, was always a demonstration of power and a way that you told stories about yourself. And of course, the stories that you want to have represented about yourself. And they're often the stories that have lasted. That's how we understand a lot of what we do about the Renaissance, is looking to the buildings and the art to try to make sense of these people and what they were trying to put across politically.
Yeah, so like today, would that be like the Prime Minister just going somewhere and having a commission of a giant painting?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to translate into today because we have forms where, let's say in the Australian environment, or even actually in the British or the American environment, when somebody's elected to high power, they move into a house that represents that high power, so that there's often a kind of residence that you move to. That's very different to the sort of environment of the Renaissance, where you build your own personal manor house to demonstrate your power. And so each of the different dynasties that are vying for power in the Renaissance are each building their own magnificent mansion. Perhaps Trump is a better example of that kind of way of thinking, of the cultural politics of, say, Mar-a-Lago, is more akin to the Renaissance style than, say 10 Downing Street or, Kirribilli House in Australia, which it goes with the person.
I love how Trump is a Renaissance man.
Yes.
Extravagance. Never heard of him described like that.
Yes, well, I think he thinks through the cultural politics of power in that way. He's got an eye for the visuals and for the kind of cultural forms in which you can convey it. And so and I guess actually he is a very good example of somebody who communicates through cultural media. So maybe those media have changed and now we think about social media, but his messaging is very visual. It's very simple, and that is not dissimilar to these Renaissance princes who have emblems that they plaster on every building, so you know immediately the minute you see the Medici balls, okay, it's a Medici house, or you see somebody's kind of symbol and you know exactly who it belongs to in a very...
like the Trump Tower.
Exactly. So I don't think this is unusual. Buildings. Yeah, I don't think this is unusual to Catherine. It's exactly the model of the time. What is unusual for Catherine is that most of the elite women are never in a position to have access to the purse strings to make the story about them. And to some extent, although Catherine is never the person directly in power, she has a lot of influence. She's able to control funding, to put forward political messages. They're not exclusively about her. They're very often about her dynasty, about her sons. But nonetheless, she's one of a fairly small number of women who are able to create political stories from that era.
In the mid-16th century, Catherine de Medici and her son, the king, went on a grand tour of France. The purpose of this tour was to strengthen the bond between the French court and the various regions of the kingdom. It would also demonstrate the power and wealth of the monarchy. During the tour, Catherine and Charles visited many cities and towns all over France, including Lyon, Tours, Bordeaux, Toulouse, and Marseille. They were welcomed with great fanfare everywhere they went, with parades, feasts, and other public events organised in their honour. Cities would be decorated with elaborate arches and other adornments symbolising the monarchy, the streets lined with cheering crowds. In the larger cities, such as Lyon, Catherine and Charles were greeted by the city's mayor and other dignitaries. They were treated to a series of festivities including jousting tournaments, musical performances, and banquets. The Grand Tour was also an opportunity for Catherine and Charles to meet with local officials, nobles, and other influential people, and to hear their concerns and grievances. This helped Catherine to better understand the needs of the various regions of France to govern the kingdom more effectively. It was during this tour that the royal court also went to Bayonne, where the Queen Mother would see her daughter, who had married the King of Spain, Philip II.
Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Brasher. I'm an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney, in the School of Design. I'm a fashion and costume historian and costume designer, but I also play viola. So I've definitely got an interest in the intersection of performance costume and theatrical costume.
The Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici, and took her 13-year-old son on a tour de France, basically to say, look at us, we're your royal family. And in doing so, she did it in an extravagant way. And they were called the Magnificences, I think, what she would do. And some of the symbols for the royal family that they would use, we can see on this set of instruments that are called the Charles IX instruments that Andrea Amati made.
What we do know is that she was like going all out with these court festivals at the time to really impress people. And it was also like, people are saying, it's to impress everyone with their wealth and divert attention to the fact that there was like this civil war between Catholics and Protestants that, ended up with this really brutal St. Bartholomew Day's massacre in, 1572, I think.
Yeah, another royal wedding.
Yeah, 1572, the marriage of Margaret Valois to Henry of Navarre. So what she's also doing, though, is really cementing her son's legitimacy to be the king. It's like she's trotting him round, basically, and it's like, nah, this is your king. This is what we're going on, and using this spectacle to do it. And she goes all out with it, as evinced by these incredible instruments, these Amati instruments. And when she finally gets to Spain, she put on huge spectacles as well. And her daughter had married King Philip II. So she's really cementing alliances with the Catholic world as well, because we've got the English Protestants, of course, at the time, stirring things up with the Dutch Protestants. So she's kind of trying to use spectacle to, establish this legitimacy of Catholicism across Europe, in this band across Europe that also, I think the Habsburgs, they're Catholic as well, and sort of across Italy and Spain and this band. So that's really important. But also French rule as well versus these other Catholic empires. So she's really solidifying that.
I spoke to Benjamin Herbert, Oxford-based expert dealer author.
The first instruments that survive are for the French court, so Catherine de Medici seems to have ordered them for Charles IX of France. And we were talking privately about the Valois tapestries, which amazing tapestries in the Vatican, which celebrate how great Catherine de Medici and Charles IX was. But it's a political smokescreen. It's absolute disaster, but they put all their money into showing how wonderful they are. And we see that there's these incredible, there's this incredible sort of set campaign trail around France, rather like Trump, if I'm allowed to say that.
Like Trump meets the Tour de France.
I think so. I mean, going to different cities, having their rallies, showing how great they are, showing off with these incredible, festivals of culture, where and at every single one, they take something from Ovid's Metamorphosis and they recreate it on a huge theatrical scale. And this is actually before the ballet, it's before the opera, it's before orchestral music as we think of it. And you've got a band of maybe 12 Amati violins providing the music for things which are so dramatic that in one case at Bayonne, they put some of the musicians in an artificial dolphin and sail the artificial dolphin around a flooded artificial lake. In order to, and that just gives you the epic size of these happenings, and
at the same time, you've got the Spanish representative trying to talk politics and war, and you've got Catherine going, "Look at that scantily clad nymph on a shell coming by on a dolphin."
Everything is about distraction. I
think it's amazing because in the background you've got the wars of religion in France on one level, and then you've got this other level of these amazing festivities that Catherine's putting on with their court, which are all about harmony and getting along with each other and justice, and how amazing the royal family are.
It's absolutely amazing. I mean, at one level, it seems to be the prototype for a Trump campaign rally, and on the other, this is the thing which then leads to, out of this comes the skills of the dancers, which by the 1580s becomes ballet. Out of this comes the idea of orchestral music. Out of this directly comes the English court masque, which is sort of a reduced set of players. We actually know this dolphin and artificial thing when Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, in 1572 wants to impress Queen Elizabeth. There's sort of a will he, won't he marry her kind of thing. And to sort of his penance is to put something on, and it's a smaller version of what happens at Bayonne. So it's a smaller dolphin.
Oh, he whips out the dolphin.
He whips out the dolphin, yeah. and does that at Kenilworth Castle with an artificial lake and all of that. And then we see from that the English court masque arise. So, ballet, opera, Monteverdi's Orfeo is exactly one of these again. And, everything comes back to this thing, and the prototype of the Trump rally.
Where's his dolphin? Huh?
I think that'll prevent him from becoming president again.
It was during this tour that the royal court also went to Bayonne, where the Queen Mother would see her daughter, who had married the King of Spain, Philip II. You have the Charles IX instruments that are painted, but there's also a one that's decorated for the King Philip of Spain.
One of the ideas is that these are for Philip II of Spain, in which case the likely time is during the time of Elizabeth de Valois. If so, they are probably earlier because the need for them has got more to do with Elizabeth de Valois' marriage than anything else. Now, the fly in the ointment is that when we look at all the violins which went to France, which have got the French paintings on them, now we've we actually happen to know from engravings that the performance position of these musicians was really shoulder to shoulder, and at some point I think someone must have dropped one of them and whoever the luthier was, sometime around the 1580s or something like that, decided that what they needed to do was take the corners off and sand them down. And if you look at any of the Andrea Amatis that are painted, you see these really worn down, sanded down corners, not just shortened but rounded off so that they're almost sort of like a chisel edge where they meet the rib. And we see those on the Philip II of Spain ones as well. So that suggests that the same luthier had the same way with these after they were made. And we don't see them on ones which we don't think ever went to France. So the other possibility with the Philip II is actually that these may have, in order for the great festivity at Bayonne, which is the peace between, it's designed to celebrate the peace between France and Spain. It's actually the only time that poor Elizabeth got to see her mother again, and Philip II threw a hissy fit and refused to go and sent his wife as an emissary because he felt it was a bit of a, he'd been suckered into a peace that he didn't want. But everything there's about harmony, and a lot when you look at a lot of the other things that happen at Bayonne, it's about the union between Mars and Venus, which is the creation of harmony, and all of these things through mythology. So the idea that the music is made half of Spanish, half of French representative instruments would actually, that would be so central to what the festivity of Bayonne is, that I rather suspect that these things were entirely created by the French for a propaganda of harmony.
So they're saying that we're so close that look, we're playing on instruments that are representing the Spanish court because we're just in such harmony with that country.
And actually, the one Andrea Amati, which for years was unrecognised in the Musée de la Musique in Paris, is a chopped down viola from the Philip II set. So whilst all the other ones are sped around the world, the one French Andrea it's a Spanish one, which is evidence of nothing and evidence of everything at the same time.
Why are we talking about this trip to Bayonne? What does it have to do with the Amati family? Well, things are heating up in France. There is a civil war happening between the Catholics and the Protestants. The instruments the Amatis have made to deliver to the French court have messages on them indicating where their loyalties lie. Catherine would have undoubtedly realised the precarious position of being in power. And good relations with the Spanish was a must. They were an immense superpower at the time. Her daughter was the wife of the King of Spain. That was a good start. But her son was still dangerously young, and factions at court would always be at work trying to take power. Besides the Charles IX instruments, the Amati workshop also produced similar instruments with the Spanish royal insignias. Were these commissions from the Habsburgs, or were they used as a political message ordered by someone else completely? There are several ideas surrounding this second set of decorated instruments. Firstly, they were ordered by the Spanish court, perhaps to celebrate the wedding of Elizabeth de Valois, Catherine de Medici's daughter, to King Philip of Spain. The second hypothesis is that they were ordered by the French court to demonstrate the strong relationship between the two countries and the extent of the harmony that existed between them. Look, we're playing on instruments with your coat of arms on them. We have to be friends. These are just two of many ideas surrounding the set of instruments bearing the Spanish heraldic symbols. France is literally in between the Protestant northern countries and the Catholic southern countries of Europe. The French royal family were walking on a tightrope of diplomacy. There were both very powerful Catholics and Protestants at the French court as the violins fiddled away. In the next episode, we will see how Catherine de Medici handles this situation and the repercussions the tensions in France will have on all of Europe and inevitably reaching Cremona and the Amati family. I would like to thank my lovely guests, Dr. John Gagne, Dr. Peter Jensen, John Dilworth, Dr. Susan Broomhall, Dr. Emily Brayshaw, and Benjamin Hebbert. You can leave a comment and follow the podcast at theviolinchronicles.podbean.com. I have an Instagram and even an email at theviolinchronicles@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed this podcast or learnt something new, please tell a friend about it. Or you can give it a review or a star somewhere. You are listening to a live recording of Timo Vico of the Australian Chamber Orchestra playing on an Amati Brothers cello. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to catch you next time on the Violin Chronicles.